You're listening to Thunderquack Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to Thunderquack Perfect 10, the podcast where we explore pop culture masterpieces. I'm your host, Michael Cohen. What is a perfect 10? Simply put, a perfect 10 is a piece of pop culture media we love unconditionally. So throw away your review score because around here, everything is a 10 out of 10. Are you ready for some blitzball? We're jumping back into the world of Final Fantasy with the 10th installment in the series with Tim Dippel. Tim, welcome to Perfect 10 proper. This is your first time actually on the podcast, but you've been around for a while.
Yeah, I'm glad to finally have something that I could talk about here. I wasn't really sure about a topic for a while.
Yeah. For those who don't know, Tim hosts our companion podcast, Perfect 10 Pop Quiz, which for every episode of Perfect 10, there is a pop quiz as well. That is 10 questions about whatever that perfect 10 topic is. So I mean, you've been doing that since day one. And I mean, like, you came to me and said, "Hey, I want to do this. You cool with it?" And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely." And it was a Patreon exclusive for a while, but then I just, this is what always happens with Patreon exclusives, is that like our Patreon audience is awesome but not huge, and you're putting so much work into it, and I was like, I really wish that people could listen to this. So now we put them on the proper the feed with everything else, and so you can just enjoy the Perfect 10 pop quiz just as you do Perfect 10, and yeah, it's awesome that that we get to do that because of all of the work that you do. So there's never been an opportunity for me to really thank you formally on the podcast in the past. So now that you're here, I can say thanks for all that work. It's
Well,
awesome.
of course. I mean, it's a passion project of mine. I've always been very big on trivia. I write and host trivia locally and for my own podcast, so it kind of fit to do just kind of a little 10 question about each topic. So
Yeah.
it's a lot of fun learning about properties that maybe I was not familiar with. I don't know if you
Yes.
can tell which ones I do and do not know when I do the quizzes, but yeah, it's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah, real quick. See, you got to be better at plugging yourself because you said your podcast, but you didn't say the name of your podcast. So what's your podcast?
Yeah, so I am one of the hosts of a podcast called the Frenemy Trivia Podcast. It's basically a challenging trivia game show where we take four players, we split them up into two teams and pit them up against each other against trivia. And then once one team runs out of points or we run out of, we hit the end of 12 questions, then we take the winning team and we split them up and they go head to head, one on one, till we crown a frenemy of the best frenemy of the week. It's a little bit more adult oriented because we do drink and we do cuss and
Mm-hmm.
stuff like that. So maybe not with your kids, but it's a lot of fun. We have a lot of people from all walks of life, up to and including we've had Jeopardy Tournament of Champions contestants on there, all the way down to my father-in-law has been on there. Some of my best friends have been on there, so it's a little bit of everybody on there. So we have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so great. I awesome. Well, let's get into this topic, into our episode, and talking about Final Fantasy X, our second Final Fantasy installment, but actually kind of almost our third, because we've also talked about Final Fantasy 16. Joe and I did that one, and we've talked about Kingdom Hearts. So the majority of our video game Perfect 10 conversations so far have been about Final Fantasy / Square properties. So I and Final Fantasy 10 characters show up in 2 out of those 3. So um yeah, but before we get into the nitty gritty and talking about Final Fantasy X, let me just give everybody the quick primer. So here we go. What is Final Fantasy X? Come with us on a journey across the idyllic world of Spira, from the tropical island city of Besaid to the sunken ruins of Xanarkand, as we follow the summoner Yuna and her guardians on their quest to awaken the Aeons and defeat the Leviathan Sin before it destroys the world. Released in 2001 for the PlayStation 2, Final Fantasy X is the first fully voiced installment in the series, bringing the characters to life in a way no game before had accomplished. Along with its groundbreaking graphics and, at the time, mind-blowing full-motion video cinematics, the epic story of Tidus, Yuna, and their allies marks a milestone in the evolution of video gaming and is firmly cemented in the hearts of Final Fantasy fans the world over. So hop aboard the airship and hold on tight, because it's time to dig into Final Fantasy X. Okay, let's start this the way that we generally start this. It's funny because sometimes I'll record with Joe, and when I record with Joe, we just kind of go off. And same with Amanda, because we record so often. But getting, and I just recorded with Amanda recently. So getting back to our basics of Perfect 10. Tell me about your experience the first time you played this game. Let's start there.
Okay. So a little bit of a warning here.
Yeah.
Based on my history with this game, there's a very good chance that this turns into a free therapy session. Because my first interaction with this game was probably about a couple of months after my parents split. And my dad immediately had another girlfriend who had kids and had a PlayStation. I need to preface this with, I have never owned a PlayStation system, and I have bought this game 3 times. That is how much I love Final Fantasy X. So, when I would go over to my dad's house for visits, uh his now stepson had a PlayStation 2, so I bought Final Fantasy X, so when I was over there, I had something I could do. And so that's my first interaction with this game. I had been reading about it in Electronic Gaming Monthly. Is that even the thing anymore?
It's not anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I think it finally shut down.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I had the EGM that reviewed it and gave it top marks. I think this one actually is a 10 out of 10 or a 9 out of 10 in EGM. And I was like, oh, I have to play this game. I had never played anything other than Final Fantasy 1. I Like I said, I never owned a PlayStation, so I skipped 7, 8, and 9, which everybody was all about, and went straight to 10, and I just fell in love with this game.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so funny, because I mean, like, that's quintessentially what a Perfect 10 is, right? We
Right.
talk about it. It's not an objective 10 out of 10. This is not about, although, like, Final Fantasy X was very well reviewed, very well received critically and by fans. And most of the stuff that we end up talking about is of that ilk, right? We generally are talking about stuff that is pretty well received and well regarded. But the reason why we pick the topics that we do on Perfect 10, or at least what I aim for, what I steer my guests towards, is exactly what you just talked about. There's a connection for you to Final Fantasy X that is so much deeper than the actual, content of the media. And that's kind of at the core of what this podcast really wants to get to, right? Like every time we get into a really really great discussion, it is often because there is some sort of a deeper connection like that. And I'll say that like Final Fantasy 8 for me, which is my was my favorite in the series until I played 16. I it similarly had connections in that way. I just sort of not quite as monumental as yours. I think that I think that's a rough transition to be going through. And so taking solace in a piece of media is always a good move by my book. Like that's the same way that I deal with you know emotional trauma. But Final Fantasy VIII was definitely it was there for me in a time when I really didn't have a lot of other stuff to to dig into. I was sort of like in between friend groups. It was like a really weird part of my life. Very tumultuous stuff going on with my family. Um, so when I got into that game, it was like, yeah, this is like it's respite, right? Like it's you get to escape into it. And then similarly with Final Fantasy 16, I think that it cemented itself in that way because I was playing it. I had basically played through the entire game. I talked about this, I think, on the previous episode of Perfect 10. And the the night before the meeting that I had with my boss, where I was not sure what this meeting was about with the boss and the head of HR, and I was a little bit worried. I needed a distraction, and so I finished Final Fantasy 16. And then the next day, I woke up in the morning and got laid off. So, yeah, so Clive's journey and the emotionality of it and all of that stuff really resonated for me because I was obviously going through a big life change with that as well. So it's funny to me how these things they find their way in, right? Like they
Right.
but specifically with Final Fantasy games, there I think there is actually something there with the good ones, like with the ones that mean something. You talk to people about where they were at in their life and which one's their favorite, and there's oftentimes some sort of deeper connection to it, that it's like, oh, okay, cool, yeah, so you were going through a thing and you related to a character in this game, and then that I it brought it deeper into your life and is like indelible. It's also, I think it's just a way that we kind of like cover up, not cover up, but like um I it's a way that we're able to frame a period of time in our life, right? Like
Right.
something difficult is happening, but then you can go like, well, I also remember I was playing this game. I was
Yeah.
playing this one, and it was special and important, right?
So now I have to ask. I think
Yeah.
you're 2 years older than I am, right? You were 85?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So I was 87. So 8 was released in 1999
Yeah.
and 10 was released in 2001. So it hit both of us when we were 14.
I didn't play 8 right away. I probably
Oh,
would have
okay.
played it the next year. If not, yeah, maybe even after that.
It's just something
Yeah,
about
no, I
like
guess that would
that
have been 15.
age.
I played it the next year. But yes. Yeah, for sure. I
Um
mean, that's when you're 14, 15, that's when you hit the age where especially with the older ones, the reading comprehension is there, right? You have to
right.
hit a certain level in order to be able to play through a Final Fantasy game. And yeah, you have to have a certain level of media literacy in order to follow Final Fantasy. It is very similar to Shakespeare. I can't believe I've never brought this up before, as we've talked about Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts so much, but like very, very similar in terms of structure and the um, intellectual investment required in order to follow this stuff. Because you could play through an entire Final Fantasy game mechanically and not grasp the story whatsoever,
Absolutely.
if you're not paying close enough attention. And I have definitely encountered people who are like, Final Fantasy VII is the best Final Fantasy, and I'll be like, okay, cool, why? And then they're like, because Cloud has big sword, and you're like, you try and dig deeper with them on like what, like, do this conversation that we're about to have, and they're just like, I really liked it, and it's like, yeah, you were like 11 when you played that, hey, and
Right.
then
You
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 haven't played
totally
it
missed
since.
all the ecological
Yeah,
underpinnings
yeah.
and
I remember when Advent Children was coming out and everybody was all hyped on Final Fantasy VII, and because I had not played 7, I tried to talk to some of my friends about it to be like, okay, so like get me up to speed here. Like, what do I need to know in order to watch Advent Children? And they couldn't for the life of them tell me the story. They couldn't
yeah.
tell me what Final Fantasy was about, and I had to like go off and do my own research and figure it out before I watched the movie. And this is in the days Advent Children was like maybe
Ooh.
early days of YouTube. I don't remember if that's like 2000 and it might be like 2006, 2007. So like YouTube is basically not a thing yet.
It was 2005 actually. So right
2005. So YouTube's definitely not a thing yet. Like
yeah.
it maybe is out, but yeah, it hasn't been bought by Google, that's for sure. Like it's just yeah, YouTube is a place where people upload cat videos and stuff. So the video essay and that sort of thing, you can't really nowadays you're like, "Oh, I let me get up to speed on this franchise." There's a YouTube video for that.
Right.
But yeah, I yeah, it's just it's funny to me how people will play these games, and some folks they are just like playing the game, and other people are like deeply invested in the story, because like I couldn't tell you mechanically what makes Final Fantasy X different from the other ones, because they all have their subtle differences, right?
Right.
I couldn't tell like what's the difference, like because in 8 you use the Guardian forces, you equip them, and then that's how you learn like your special techniques and stuff like that, so that you can perform magic and all of those sorts of things. But then you also need to use the draw system in order to have the resources to use the magic, and it's like a whole thing. And then I know in Final Fantasy 7 it's materia, and in 6 it's the summons, what do they call them in that, the espers,
Mm.
that a lot of that stuff comes from. So like depending on what esper you have determines what magic your character learns. But like when it comes to Final Fantasy X, I played it. I played a lot of it. Like I played. We were talking before. I don't think that I ever finished the story, which is pretty
Right.
common with me with RPGs. But I put upwards of 100 hours into this game easy. And I couldn't tell you. What the is this one of the one with spheres? No, that's
This is the one that introduced the sphere grid. I was just getting ready to
okay.
talk about that.
Okay.
Because that was such an interesting mechanic to the game. Because if you played the game long enough,
Mhm.
you could essentially make all of your characters exactly the same.
Yeah, because you
Uh,
can fill out the entire sphere grid.
the entire massive sphere grid,
Yeah.
which would have been very difficult to do, but it would have been possible. So you could, there were some characters that were definitely your white mage stereotype in Yuna. You've got your black mage in Lulu. Um, you've got your warrior, your tank. But you could also take like, especially Kamari was one that thrived on being kind of a jack of all trades. So if
Mhm.
whatever you needed, you could kind of train him to do what other characters are doing. So you always
Yeah.
have that backup.
Yeah, and this was like the big departure from sort of the just like standard leveling system, right? Like 8 and 9, I don't even man, what does 9 do? I don't even remember. But 8 started on that path, but I feel like 10 was the first one that really like pulled you off in a different direction with the ability to like customize your character, for lack of a better way of looking at it, right? Like the RPG aspect of it, the role playing aspect of it really came in 10, where you're like, oh, because each character starts like on the massive sphere grid, like in a different location, basically,
Hmm.
right? And it's like and so they're sort of centered around, like you said, like those archetypical Final Fantasy classes, like white mage and black mage and warrior, fighter, what have you, right?
Right.
Yeah, now it's all coming back to me now. But it's funny because I conflate it, I think, a lot with Final Fantasy 12, which I played more of, but didn't get as far in the story because Final Fantasy 12 is like, oh my god, that game is dense. It's not good. I don't think Final Fantasy 12 is good. I love conceptually what they tried to do with it, but I it didn't work. It didn't work. That was when I think Square they were in a weird spot where they were trying to compete with World of Warcraft. So you've got like 11, and then uh 11 being an online game, and then 12 being offline again, but like single player MMO is the best way that I just can describe that game. They tried to do that, but the leveling system in 12 is very similar to the spheres
Okay.
in the sphere grid in 10. But yeah, the people who are like hardcore 12 fans are going to be mad at me, A, for not being as hardcore of a 12 fan, but B, for like being that reductive of like, yeah, they're really similar. It's actually the differences are very okay, whatever. But back into 10. Let's get deep into this. So I wouldn't personally put Final Fantasy 10 into the perfect 10 category. This is one of the rare episodes where this one doesn't quite make it there for me. Most of the time we're talking about stuff and I'm like on the same page with the guest, but I'm gonna actually like let you take the lead on a lot of this because you have the deeper connection to Final Fantasy X. So beyond what you talked about already, that sort of first encounter with it and the context around that, what is it about Final Fantasy X as opposed to the other ones that we've just mentioned and all of the installments in the series? Now we're up to 16, right? What is it about 10 that resonates for you?
So what I so as I mentioned, I never owned a PlayStation, so I never
Mm-hmm.
played 7, 8, or 9. I tried 13 because 13 came to to Xbox, and I
Mm-hmm.
didn't care for the battle system there. But for 10, it kind of just hit that sweet spot for me. It was an in-depth story. I enjoy the turn-based battle, but ultimately Final Fantasy X was one of those games that just showed me what video games could be. Like it felt like such an evolutionary step in
Mm-hmm.
terms of video games as a whole, in terms of the graphics levels, the voices, all of that. And we'll get to who the voices are here soon. But when about a couple hours into the game and you're approaching the city of Luca, and I think all of a sudden drawing a blank on whether it was Luke. Yeah, you approach Luca and you get like this outshot of the water and the world and all of that. And my jaw, when I tell you it dropped in 2002 when I
Mm-hmm.
played this
Mm-hmm.
game. It dropped in 2014 when I played the remaster, and it dropped 2 years ago when I bought it for the Nintendo Switch. Every time that shot takes my breath away and reminds me this is what I love about video games: an expansive world, immersive graphics, immersive story, all of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I think that's totally valid, right? Because 10 is the game that really brings it into, at the time, what we called next gen, right?
right.
And that was, I think, I mean, like, I'm sure that when the N64 and the PlayStation came out, that people were using the term next gen, but I think the thing about the leap to the Dreamcast and PlayStation 2, and eventually the Xbox as well, was that it was a very like stark difference from what the N64 and the PlayStation were capable of. It's funny because like the PlayStation was this thing 32-bit, right, where it was a big jump up from 16-bit graphics, the Genesis and the Super Nintendo, and the TurboGrafx 16 and consoles like that, which were still primarily 2D consoles, right? You had a few exceptions like Star Fox and that sort of thing, some sort of like 2.5D stuff like Mario Kart that the Super Nintendo was able to do that the Genesis was not able to do in the same way. And then you had with the blast processor in the Sega Genesis, you had the ability to do like 3D rendered characters like Sonic, and then eventually like Vector Man and stuff like that all looked really cool, but was ultimately all just like manipulations of 2D, right? They were all still just like bitmaps on a screen. And then the PlayStation comes along and brings in 3D graphics. The N64 kind of pluses that a little bit, but then yeah, like starting with the Dreamcast, but then followed very quickly by the PlayStation 2, you got not just 3D graphics, but like fully immersive worlds, right? I
Mhm.
think that was the big difference, is that like Mario 64 was really cool, but everything was just kind of like this weird abstract floating, like the worlds that you were in didn't feel realized, right?
Yeah.
Like they felt like, in the same way that when you play Super Mario Brothers, it's like, okay, so there's just blocks floating in the air, right? But on the PlayStation 2, all of a sudden we were getting games like, I mean, and again on the Dreamcast as well, we were getting Sonic Adventure and you know oh, I can't, why can't I think of the fighting game? I don't know. We had like Soul Calibur and oh, what's that game? I can't think of it. It was a beautiful game, but I there were so many games on that console and then on the PlayStation 2 that were like these actual worlds that you could inhabit, right? And Final
Right.
Fantasy X was one of those first ones. Again, followed very quickly by Kingdom Hearts, right? Like Kingdom Hearts is hot on its heels with the voice acting and the 3D world and stuff. And honestly, Kingdom Hearts kind of ends up, I think, eating Final Fantasy X's lunch a little bit, because FF10 is going for photorealism, and then Kingdom Hearts is able to come in with the more anime style and use the those sort of like 3D painted textures on very rudimentary polygonal characters to get more of a 3D look, right? Like they like that in Kingdom Hearts, they really figured out like, oh, if we just like manipulate the textures in this way, it'll give a 3D effect to certain things that we can't actually do 3D. And then eventually, like I mean, in computer animation, they've already figured out bump mapping and stuff like that. But eventually they start to bring that sort of technique as well to games. But yeah, is when you look at, it's funny because right now you look at Final Fantasy X and you think of the remake. I think everybody would think of the remake, um, like the HD remaster, and I at the time, if you look at the graphics of the original on the PlayStation 2, it is very like, it's rough, but at the
Yeah.
time it was like, holy crap, video games are so rad. Right? um and then on top of that, as they had done starting with 7, getting the full motion video in there, otherwise now we would call it it's a CG cinematic, right? But at
Right.
the time we called them FMVs, and that full motion video, which are just videos. They're just videos. It's just pre-rendered CG. But that CG that they were doing was like the best. It was the best imaginable. And so that game opens with an incredible FMV, and then you get right into it. And it's very like, it is interspersed with a lot of awesome, I mean, every character introduction, right, is a great cinematic,
Mhm.
and obviously all of the big set pieces also have great cinematics as well. So
There's also
um
the amazing like overdrive scenes, especially for the Aeons.
yeah,
The Aeons were so rad in that rendering.
yeah, I mean summons are what Final Fantasy is all about, right? Like that's the whole deal. and I think actually it's tough. I really, really like the summons in 8, and
Mm,
that's like part of my personal connection to that. But I think that the way that they're presented in 10 is some of the best that they've ever done,
yeah.
for sure. Yeah,
Um, let's talk about the big step forward that came with Final Fantasy X, and this is the
yeah,
first one that introduced actual voices for characters.
yeah,
Um, Specifically, the obvious one. This was my introduction to James Arnold Taylor. Um, I think I don't know that I was. I mean, I definitely wasn't familiar with him at the time. Um, but voicing, I've heard it pronounced Titus or Titus, depending on who you are.
yeah,
Uh, voicing that main character, and then to find out later, oh, he's Obi-Wan.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. He has. I don't think he's played Obi-Wan yet.
no, because this would be
Yeah,
2001.
yeah, because I think the first time was in the micro series, right? So that's like it's like a couple years later, 3 years later. When's the micro series? 2003, 2004. Yeah, I think maybe like James Arnold Taylor at the time, people would know if they had played. Actually, he's not the voice in the first Ratchet game. He comes in the second Ratchet game, and then he's played the character ever since. But I'm pretty sure on that. Now I'm like double checking. I'm on IMDb presently, but I think Johnny Test may have already been on the air, and I think that might have been like the main thing that folks would have known James Arnold Taylor from at the time, that his voice would have been recognizable from.
At this point, it looks like, at least according to his wiki, the only things he really did. This might have been. Oh no, he did some Johnny Bravo
There you
characters,
go.
and that's about it. Like this was his second role. It looks like. Um, because then he voiced Pippin in the Fellowship of the Ring video game. But this was his first video game, and uh, nothing else on his IMDb
Oh wow. Okay. Yeah. So
after Johnny Bravo in '97.
that's awesome. Like that. This is sort of like the beginning of it. But yeah, yeah. It's definitely like like an introduction to that actor, and so funny that he becomes such a major part of so many pieces of pop culture after that, right? But especially as Obi-Wan Kenobi, and like very near and dear to this audience, I think, as a result. Um, but yeah, I think to those who played the game, it's like, well, maybe Obi-Wan sounds like Titus more than the other way around. But they also like they're different performances, right? Like
Very
he
different, to the point that I didn't realize it was the same actor for a long time.
yeah, yeah. But it's fun when you get into like the Johnny Test and that sort of thing. It's like, oh, you hear that, right? You hear that connection, because that's a little bit closer to his actual voice, when he plays characters like that. But yeah, I this game is such an interesting thing to me, because at the time, obviously, we didn't have a lot to compare it to. It was one of the very first, fully voiced games. There was quite a lot of voice acting in the PlayStation era, like the original PlayStation, with things like Metal Gear Solid. But Metal Gear Solid was probably like the only game that really used it in a serious way, right? Everybody else was kind of doing cheesy stuff when it came to voice acting. Um, but then this game comes along, and it's like, we say fully voiced. There's a lot of reading. There's still a lot of reading. It's really only like sort of cutscenes and that sort of thing where we're getting voice acting, key parts of the story. And it's actually, by today's standard, it's quite cringe. It's quite
Oh,
cringe.
there's definitely cringe scenes. The laughing scene.
I mean, that's a meme, right? Like that one is like, that's beyond just like cringe into like, iconic status, right?
Yeah,
The Titus laugh is iconic.
it's right there with, the I don't like sand.
Yeah.
It gets everywhere. But you know what? I love that scene. I love that
It
connection that Yuna and Titus form in that moment.
Yeah, the thing about that scene is that, like, I feel like a lot of people skipped 10. It's not one that everybody has played in the way that, like, 7 is one that everybody played, and even because of how big 7 was, a lot of people played 8. But then 9 was a disappointment for a lot of fans, and so people skipped 10,
Mm.
right? Um and so you have a lot of people out there who are like, they're gamers, they're in the gaming sphere, right? But they didn't actually play the game, and so they see that and then they go, oh my god, the voice acting in this game is so bad, look at this. And it's like, first off, don't ever talk about my boy James Arnold Taylor that way. And second, it's like, you're missing all of the context. It's supposed to be a bad laugh, right?
Right.
Like the scene is like, there's a really cool thing in this game, in the setting where it's like, the story, as most Final Fantasy games are, is this like cataclysmic thing that we're trying to prevent, right?
Hmm.
There's an otherworldly, or like immense threat that we have to face, and it's seemingly, unstoppable, daunting, all of that sort of thing. And there's a lot of destruction, there's a lot of death, there's a lot of like bummer stuff in the story, right? But we're in this incredible, beautiful environment in this one. It's like every environment is basically tropical in this game. Like, that's kind of the vibes, surf vibes all the way through, right? Um, but the story really is quite depressing at a certain point. And it's meant to be, right? Like, you're
Yeah.
kind of, you're going along and you're realizing that, like, Yuna is going through all of this in order to save everybody, but it's probably gonna
It
ultimately end up with her sacrifice, right?
it's a suicide quest.
Yeah, yeah. And everybody knows this except for Titus, right?
Right.
And she's all bummed out. A bunch of people have died, right? If I'm remembering where this is in the game, right? Sin has just like laid waste to something, or either
Yeah.
that or they were just betrayed.
So every 10 years Sin comes back.
Yeah.
S- Yuna's father was the last one to defeat Sin. Um, and so when the when the game, I almost said show, when the game starts, very early on, you end up traveling to Kalika village,
Mhm.
and Sin basically floods the place. So that's very early on, before you even get to Luca, that you're already seeing the immense destruction that Sin can wrought on the world.
Yeah. And so, yeah, Titus is trying to like cheer her up. And
Hmm.
so, and he's like, you just gotta, like, sometimes you just gotta smile through it. Like, you just gotta laugh. Like, even when things suck, just laugh anyways, right? And she's like, what do you mean? And he's like, just like this, watch me. And he does it, and it's the ha 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 ha. It's supposed to be a forced laugh. Like, it's James Arnold Taylor acting as Titus acting, right? And
Right.
Titus is not a good actor. It's not what, and it's actually like, it's memeable now and we meme it now, but the thing is that it's supposed to be a comedic moment in the story,
Hmm.
right? Like, that's the whole point of it in the story, is that we're supposed to laugh at Titus along with Yuna, because that's the thing, is that she's bummed out, she's depressed, and then he does this, and then she cracks a smile, right?
It,
And
it
he's like, see, you feel better already, right? Like it's a great insight into his character.
it's the positive version of when you're having a bad day, going outside and just screaming into the void to
Yeah,
just let that
yeah.
rage out. It's the positive version. It's you're having a bad day, just force yourself to laugh, because it'll get those endorphins flowing and you'll feel better.
Yeah. So when you have that context and you watch it, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, this is a great scene. This is actually perfect for what's happening in the story. But a lot of people encounter that scene, especially a lot of people nowadays who maybe aren't going to go back and play an older game. They're looking at it and being, very sort of dismissive of it, and oh, this game's pretty terrible, hey. And it's like, no, it's not. It's actually awesome. It's actually great. But all of that said, this is early days in video game voice acting. Early days.
Mhm.
And even by comparison to like anime voice acting, which is also pretty cringy at this point in time, right? If you can track down some of the original Dragon Ball Z dub, and compare it to uncut or Kai, right? Like it's almost night and day at times. Like there are some places in some of those dubs where you're like, oh boy, man, oh man, this is a choice, right? Like a character's voice will be like very cartoonish or whatever, and it's like nowadays we wouldn't do things quite that way. We there it's a little bit more nuanced, and a little bit they take things a little bit more seriously. But at
Mhm.
the time it was like, well, video games are for kids, right? And it's like, not this one. I don't know any kids who want to play this game, but
Yeah, this game, man, you wanna talk about a game. I don't even know where I wanna take this. This game is probably the one that is most responsible for eventually, um, changing the way I view religion as a whole,
Hmm,
because the whole basis of the game is that this rigid religion that everybody follows is kind of keeping everybody in a spiral of death.
yeah,
And you kind of got to break out of that spiral. I mean, that's where the name of the world Spira comes from, is the spiral of death. um and you got to break out of that religious rigidity in order to win,
yeah.
and to defeat sin once and for all. um but this I don't even know, this world, the way that they built the world and a religion and a whole group of, I guess heretics would probably be the right word for the Albed in context to, uh, the religion of Spira. And they have their own language, and like they basically built a whole new world that I have not seen quite personally, uh, built in a video game, like that many layers to a game,
Mhm. Yeah,
if
yeah,
that makes sense.
yeah, well, I mean, like that was part of the whole immersive thing, right? And I think that was always an element of Final Fantasy, and I think that Final Fantasy does that so well as a series. In that, like every time that we get an installment, we're getting another glimpse into a familiar but new iteration of this type of a world, right? And this one being the first one that was like, kind of like fully 3D, not the pre-rendered backgrounds and that sort of thing, but like actually fully 3D, voice acted, all of that. I think that they put a little extra mustard on it, you know what I mean? Like they were like, we really got to like make this one a big deal. And I think that's what you're kind of responding to is, like this world is like, it's as detailed and thought out as something like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, right?
Right.
Which, like, prior to that, Final Fantasy VIII has a great world that it takes place in, but it's just kind of the setting of the story, right? Like we know what we know about the world in order to kind of just tell that story, and that's all we need. But this one, yeah, it gives a bunch of extra stuff that's like completely unnecessary. It doesn't really it doesn't really matter. You don't really need to know it, but if you want to go down those rabbit holes, you definitely can.
Mhm.
And yeah, but I think that's also just like a hallmark of Final Fantasy as a franchise, right? Because 16 also has that element to it. There's like hundreds of years of history, obviously not literally, right? Like they don't go into every detail, but there's like a whole they built a whole system into that one so that you could explore that at your leisure, and it's basically like a wiki inside the game, along with like maps and stuff like that, so that you can see, because the game spans decades, right?
Okay.
um and so like you can there's basically like a political map where you can go back to like before the game even started and look at what the political makeup of the world was, and then like progress it forward and see how like the things that your characters do have like affected the world, and how, you know, like, okay, so we did this, and when we did this we took out that thing, and so then this other global power was able to come in and take over that part of the continent, and whatever, right? Like it's definitely in the other games, but I think that 10 did it in I think it was the era, right? Because this is the era of Star Wars prequels. That's how I mark it. Everybody was trying to do that. Everybody was trying to have their um, you know, we're in the era of Star Wars prequels, but we're before the MCU, if that
Yeah.
makes sense to people, where it's like we don't have like a shared universe story going on or something like that, but what we do have is um these incredibly detailed worlds that, like, this one thing that was on screen for 2 seconds and is actually quite inconsequential to the story itself has like a whole backstory that you can dig into, right? And that was a very like George Lucas inspired way of telling a story, I think, because that's what everybody wanted. Everybody wanted to be the next Star Wars, and everybody was chasing that success. And
Right.
I think Final Fantasy was no different, right? But yeah, it's uh, this is kind of that era of like, oh, we gotta, and I mean, like, Lord of the Rings is also actively coming out in the theaters at this point, so that I think is also a bit of an influence, because it's all that Tolkien. Here's a language, here's a race of people, and all of that sort of thing. Yeah, it's definitely of the time. Um, I think we still do it in media now, but not in the same way that they would do it back then.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, but it is a great world, right? I think part of that is the story, because you have to have this whole history of what the world was before Sin, and then you also have to have the sort of prequel story that is inside the story of Jecht and um so forgive me, whatever Yuna's father's name is.
Braska.
Braska, yeah, right. So you and Orin, right, who's like your Obi-Wan Kenobi character, quite literally,
Right.
in a lot of ways. Um, and yeah, so like you when you do that type of a story, I think you have to flesh that stuff out. You have to have that world. You have to know where people were, and you know what the makeup of it was. But Final Fantasy is also just really good at that political stuff, right? From I think 6 forward, it's pretty good about digging into that sort of a story with like this political intrigue aspect of it, of, you know, it's always about some dude who's after power. That's ultimately what every single one of these Final Fantasies is about.
It
It's like
is.
one guy who's like, I'm going to be the most powerful. Sometimes they're not a guy. Sometimes they're like a god or something, like in Final Fantasy 16. But most of the time, it's like a Kefka or Seymour or whatever. Right? Like, it's yeah,
Seymour was such a good villain that
yeah.
like arguably the hardest boss battle of the game is fighting Seymour for the last time, not the fight
Mm,
against Sin.
yeah.
Um the fight against Sin is just long and multi-stepped, but the fight against Seymour is arguably the hardest of the fights up there on Mount Gagazet, um, right after he slaughtered all the Ronso. Because great guy that Seymour. Um, that reminded me of one of the other most beautiful iconic scenes was the wedding raid um, scene that I had seen used for music videos and all sorts of things back in the 2000s. Because we're back in the age where people are making fan made music videos,
Yeah.
taking whatever song that they're feeling and superimposing it over Dragon Ball Z video, or in this case Final Fantasy X. That wedding raid where they're sliding down the ropes is still one of the best cutscenes to me. It stands out so much.
Yeah, yeah. This game has some really really cool moments in it.
Mhm.
It has a lot of style, and I think like that's one of its redeeming qualities to me, where like the story for 10 isn't necessarily my cup of tea. I enjoy it and I definitely respect it, but I'd rather sit in some of the romance in Final Fantasy VIII a little bit more, or like the 16 has such a great character journey with Clive. I wish that the romance was a little bit more front and center, but it is there. It is there if you play the side quests. But um,
And
yeah,
for me, I'm sitting here going 23 years later, it's only just hitting me that maybe one of the reasons this game resonated with me is because it's about the relationship between Titus and Jecht
yeah,
at the time when my parents were going through a divorce.
yeah, yeah.
Um, that whole father son thing, 23 years later, I'm going, oh.
Oh, oops. Oops. Yeah, oops. Turns out it was daddy issues the whole time. Yeah, I mean like it always is, but
Oops,
yeah.
oops, all daddy issues.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Yeah, yeah, it's such I that's the core of this story, right? Is this conflict between Titus and his father, and all of that messiness of it. But um yeah, let me ask this. The sequel 10-2, have you played it? Are you as in love with that as you are with 10?
I started it.
Mm,
Um, the I mean, so we're talking that came out in 2003. I was a 16-year-old boy at that time.
yeah, Dress
Um,
Spheres wasn't really your jam. You
Dress
weren't really.
Spheres, a female-led video game series was
Uh-oh.
not my jam at the time, and
Yeah.
I kind of am feeling like I should go back to that one, and give it a fair shake when I'm not the person I was 22 years ago,
Yeah.
and see whether or not I like it. It's actually one of the only video games that my wife has played was 10-2. She never played 10, but she played some 10-2. And she's not a gamer. So it's kind of just interesting that that's the only one she's played. And I loved 10 so much that 10-2 just didn't hit for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I get that. I get that. They're very different games, really. Like the interesting thing about 10-2 is how much of a departure it is from standard Final Fantasy, and that it is like the first sort of numbered sequel. Um,
right.
yeah, yeah,
Um, it's a drastic departure, and I never sat down to give it a fair shot. Um, partially because I at that point I was also getting busier as a older high school student, so I wasn't
yeah,
at my dad's as much to play or try playing 10-2 because again, I still didn't have a PlayStation.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So you had to like figure it out. Yeah, it's I played 10 at the video game store.
Mm,
I not the one that I mentioned on previous episodes. I talked about a game store called OK Video, that existed where I grew up in Penticton, but not grow. I mean, where I went to middle school and high school. I but that place had closed, but my friend Bill, who I've mentioned before on Perfect 10, I think, I'm sure I mentioned, I definitely mentioned Bill in the Pokemon episode.
I think I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah, because Bill and I played Pokemon ad nauseum. He was my Pokemon guy. He was my rival. He was my the blue to my red. So, he worked at a store called Microplay, and and they would put a game on the TV, a TV like sort of hanging from the ceiling in one corner, and I yeah, so I played through most of Final Fantasy X hanging out with him at that store.
Mm.
Just standing playing Final Fantasy X, the summer that it came out. And yeah, the summer after it came out. I can't remember exactly when it dropped, but yeah, I mean, I remember when he put it in for the first time to show me. He was like, "Check this out! Like, you're not gonna believe it." And yeah, I mean, I was like, "Oh, this is so cool!" But that's how I played the game the first time that I played it, and then I think I played it again when my friend Carl was living with me in my parents' house. He moved into my parents' basement, and he had a PlayStation 2, and so there's a few things, and so I think I played through quite a bit of it at that point. But that was when I discovered Kingdom Hearts.
Mm.
That year that he was living with us, and like, so I was using his PlayStation 2 to play Kingdom Hearts. And then eventually I would make Crystal buy a PlayStation 2 because she needed a DVD player. So when the Slim first came out, when the PlayStation 2 Slim first came out, I convinced her to spend her hard-earned money on it because I didn't have money to spend myself. And yeah, yeah, she bought a PlayStation 2, and that's when I started, like, I could actually like finish games on the
Right.
PS2. I but now I'm thinking about it, and it's like I never went back. I never went back and finished 10. I put 100 hours standing in a video game store playing that game, and made it quite a ways. Because yeah, I definitely made it to that the sequence where he's killed all of the sorry,
The
what
the Ronso.
the Ronso, yeah. Which is like deep into the game, right? But
Yeah, that's arguably just a couple hours from the end.
yeah, exactly, right. But that's like, that is such par for the course for me with RPGs, especially JRPGs. Um, But like, I think about Dragon Age Inquisition, which I'm always like, I should probably go back and finish that, because I talk about Inquisition a lot. It was like a very formative game for me. I for reason we don't need to get into it on this podcast, but it's funny because like I played a lot of it, and then this is what happens. You get to that point in the game where it actually starts to get challenging, right? Like where
Mhm.
every single one of these games is built that, like, in order to elongate the game a little bit, pad the playtime, all of a sudden there's like a steep curve
Yeah.
in difficulty, and it's like, well, have you been leveling up? Do you have all of the best equipment? Blah 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 blah, right? And so that's usually where, I mean, like, this now I know this is ADHD. That's what it is. It's I have ADHD. And so once you get into a zone of it being like, okay, you're gonna have to grind it out, or like the path isn't very clear in front of you. It's like you could go do this or this or this. And in Final Fantasy games, that often happens in sort of like the fourth act.
Right.
You get the airship, right? And once you've got an
Mhm.
airship, you can go back to all the places that you've been before. And the expectation is that you're going to go back now that you're more powerful, and you're going to do other things and explore other things and find all of the stuff that you missed and whatever. And that's always where I end up. Like, I do it for a little bit, and then it just peters out.
So
I just lose it. But
so
10 doesn't really
what
have
you're
that as
saying
much.
what you're saying is that you never got any of the celestial weapons.
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not.
Oh,
No,
let's
no,
talk
no.
about those challenges for a minute.
Yeah, yeah, go
Um,
for it. Get into it.
Other countries have rules against or laws against cruel and unusual punishment, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um,
Japan, not so much.
apparently not, because the challenges you have to go through. I was actually posting in the Discord yesterday as I was trying to get just one aspect of one of the celestial weapons, and what you have to do is ride a chocobo, which is challenging enough as it is. Um, in a race against another character. And on this path are balloons, but also birds are flying at you. And every time you get hit by a bird, you lose 3 seconds. 3 seconds is added to your time at the end.
Hmm.
Every time you get a balloon, 3 seconds is deducted from your time at the end. And to get the celestial, the I think it's the sun sigil, you have to get a perfect 0 time.
Yeah.
And it's a challenge. I spent several hours yesterday just trying to do this one aspect of it, because it's added to the fact is every time the bird hits you, it stuns you for 2 seconds. So every bird is essentially a 5-second penalization, because you get 2 seconds in the game and then 3 seconds added to your time at the end. So it's kind of brutal that way. And when you get a, what did I post yesterday, that I had a point 2 at one point and was like, this is evil. Um, and that's not even counting the one that you have to dodge 200 lightning strikes in a row.
Yeah. It's not for the faint of heart, right? Like that's the thing. Full completing any Square game is I I mean like you it's a test of sanity,
Yeah.
right? It's like are you going to do that? You are. Okay, cool. Let's just make sure that you're not psychotic. Uh yeah, cuz like the Kingdom Hearts games can be pretty obnoxious like that as well. Like the Colosseum stuff in Kingdom Hearts in the first one gets just wild. It gets so hard. Um and I think it's slightly easier to achieve than what you're describing in FF10,
Right.
but yeah, it's not as bad as Final Fantasy VIII, which has several guardian forces as well as like specific things. So there's a mini game inside Final Fantasy VIII. It's a card game, and you can only get certain cards in certain encounters, and they are one-off encounters. Like if you didn't draw during that encounter and you didn't get the card, then there's no way to go back and redo it. So there was a lot of
Oh,
stuff where it's
really?
like you had to have the guide, and you had to know. But then there were also like so there's an item that you get very early on in the game it's a lamp, and if you use it, you basically rub the lamp. You go inside the lamp and you can get Jin, which is one of the guardian forces, and I if you mess that fight up, you just don't get that guardian force.
Mm.
And the guardian forces are how you get magic in a lot of instances, right? So and certain abilities. So if you don't get that, then there's a whole sort of aspect of the game. I don't remember what pool of magic it is or whatever, but I think it's probably like time or something like that. But yeah, you just don't have it. You can't get it. You can't go back. And there's a um what are the cactus guys? Oh, what are they called? They have
Cactuar.
yeah. So there's a guardian force cactar as well, right? And finding him and getting him is also very very challenging. There's a lot of that. Now, like none of this is needed in order to beat the game,
Right.
right? This is all just like if you want to full complete, if you want to get every guardian force, if you want to be able to use all of the different types of magic which are going to come into play in certain instances and whatever, right? Time travel is a really big part of Final Fantasy VIII. So like I if you don't pay attention to the time magic in that one, most Final Fantasy games you can ignore time magic like slow and stop and stuff like that. But in Final Fantasy VIII, it's actually like you kind of have to have a little bit invested in that, in order to get through it with any kind of ease, because the sorceress is all about time manipulation stuff.
Okay.
But yeah,
Oh,
yeah. Sorry,
uh,
go ahead.
so you're dancing around talking about mini games and stuff. It's been an hour.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
How did Blitzball hit for you?
I mean, Blitzball is the number one thing about Final Fantasy X, right? Like Blitzball is the thing that it's essentially the way that the game opens,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, I mean, like Blitzball is so rad that they ripped it off in episode 3. So it's a
I was
blink and
about to
miss.
say that.
It's a blink and you miss it moment in Revenge of the Sith, but um, the quite famous scene of have you ever heard the tale of the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise? That scene is Palpatine and his little cohort at the opera, and the opera it's a Mon Calamari opera, and it takes place inside a suspended ball of water, right? And that's directly ripped off from this game. Like there is no way to look at that and the timing of it and not say that somebody at ILM played Final Fantasy X and was like, "That's pretty cool." Put it into a piece of concept art, and George Lucas was like, "Yeah, put it in the movie." And he had no idea. Like, I'm not saying George Lucas ripped off Final Fantasy X, but somebody definitely brought in an idea from this video game, and he went, put it in my movie, and they did. They take it in a different direction, so I think that it's more homage than it is a direct ripoff, because it's not like they're
Right.
playing sports, but just the idea of it. Now, that said, uh, I doubt that um, that Final Fantasy X created this concept of a suspended ball of water like this. I'm sure that there's some 1990s horror movie that does it horribly, just terribly before this, and that's where they got the idea from. But yeah, Blitzball conceptually one of the coolest things ever in Final Fantasy. In reality, plays like hot garbage.
Oh
The
yeah, but
Blitzball
I had
stuff
so much fun with it.
the Blitzball stuff is just torture to play, but that's Square was not known for action stuff at the time. I if I wish that other games would get the treatment that Final Fantasy VII gets,
Mhm.
because 7 gets to be 3 games, like full, like this incredible, like gigantic remake, and like 8 will never get that treatment, 10 will never get that treatment, and it and the biggest tragedy out of all of that is that 6 will never get that treatment, because 6
Mm.
is kind of locked in this 2D world where, like, I don't know, it's kind of good and bad, because the gameplay of 6 I think is the best gameplay in any Final Fantasy game. I think like that is the most pure, right? Before it started going to 3D and we started, you know, hit the R trigger to use your gun blade, or whatever, these little like things, that these permutations, and eventually that evolves into like active battle systems and stuff like that, like what's in the modern games, right, that are more action oriented. And that's Kingdom Hearts influence. Kingdom Hearts comes in and makes an
Mm.
action game out of Final Fantasy, and then eventually that sort of backflows into 15 and 16, right, and 7 remake and rebirth. But
Yeah, if
um
10 had the following that 7 does and got that
yeah,
remake treatment, there would totally be a Blitzball spin-off that would be like a FIFA or a
yeah,
Madden style game where you're just playing Blitzball and building a team.
yeah, and you could put Blitzball, like you would put that into the actual Final Fantasy X game, right? Like and that's probably, I think they would just like keep it inside the game, and it would just be this massive
Right.
mini game inside of this already massive game. Um but yeah, as it plays in the original, I haven't played the remake, so or remaster or whatever, so
It's
I
the
don't know.
same.
Is it the same? Yeah,
It's the
so
same. It's all a single plane. You're not going up or
yeah,
down. You're just playing on essentially the grass, the 2D field within the sphere, and so you still don't quite get a great experience on the remaster. But I had
Yeah.
so much fun with Blitzball back in the day. I played a lot of it. I think I did unlock the world champion my first playthrough. I didn't bother with it the rest of the time, which was Waka's celestial weapon. But you could
Mhm.
only get it by playing Blitzball.
Yeah, yeah. I Waka's weapons being blitzballs.
Right. Right.
I One of the funniest things in that game, I think, is Final Fantasy games have a long history of there being a brawler character, right? Like Zell in Final Fantasy VIII, who has brass knuckles, and Zack in 6, who just punches. I Does he have brass knuckles as well as like his item? I think he does, but I Waka is that character in this, and he just does like a what I don't know what the move is called, but you know, like in soccer when they sort of do like the backflip kick,
Mm.
and just like kicks balls at the bad guys, and you're just like, okay. And you're like, now he has a ball that has spikes on it, but wouldn't that hurt him to kick it? And it's like, whatever, don't think about it too much.
He's a
Yeah.
very talented Blitzball player. He can avoid the spike.
And when you get towards the end of the game and you're fighting these gigantic monsters, right? Like when you're fighting Sin, and it's just like, what's happening right now? What's happening right now? He's just kicking a ball at a whale. But
Yeah.
whatever. It's doing damage, I guess. They are also gods. This is the thing with Final Fantasy games, is that like you take on gods, and in order to take on gods, you need to become a god yourself. And so it gets preposterous, but in the best way possible.
Did
Yeah.
you have a particular favorite character that you resonated with or liked more than others?
From 10, it would probably be Auron.
Yep.
He's probably my favorite character from the game, and that is definitely informed by Kingdom Hearts, because he's a pretty major character in Kingdom Hearts as well.
Mm.
I Playing a similar ish role to what he does in this one in Final Fantasy X, where he is this, yeah, he's kind of a he is essentially Obi-Wan, right? I mean, like
Mhm.
he's from the other world. He's from this world, but then he dies kind of, and is in the dream world, and then comes back to this world with Tidus, and so he's a spirit or dream or whatever you want to say, in the entire game as well,
Yeah.
right? But is fully aware
One
of
of the
it,
major
unlike,
twists that we learn about throughout the
yeah.
course of the game.
Yeah, exactly. And so he is essentially Spirit Obi-Wan, if Spirit Obi-Wan actually did anything. Didn't just backpedal on lies constantly. Yeah, well, listen, all right. It's, if you think about it, I didn't lie. Actually, Obi-Wan, you did several times.
It just depends
Um,
on your point of view.
yeah, also didn't bother to tell Luke about his sister, didn't bother to inform him of any of the important stuff that he needs to know. Yeah, very withholding, that Obi-Wan Kenobi. He's a piece of work. But um yeah, Oren is a really great play on that archetype, because you kind of don't trust him, right? And you kind of
Yeah.
shouldn't, but you also totally can. But like he is ultimately a good guy. He is ultimately one of the heroes, but his motivation is his motivation is heroic, but I guess it's not about the motivation as much as is the method, right? Like his way of moving the characters, the manipulating everybody and moving them through the world, is seen at a certain point in the game as antagonistic, right? And yeah, I like that complexity of that character. I also really like Riku.
Hmm.
But that's just, you know, she's just a manic pixie dream girl. So like, what's, you know, it's there's an aspect there. This, I always find this so funny, because that term manic pixie dream girl has been kind of like co-opted and turned into this other thing. And I it's a bit like the term Mary Sue, right? Like
Mm.
the term takes on a life of its own and becomes a connotation and very charged. But I this is the thing about a manic pixie dream girl, is that there's really not a lot that you can do to fight against it as a guy, right? Like as a man raised in, Western culture, in and I guess even, like, Eastern, in Japanese culture as well. um we are all gonna fall prey to a manic pixie dream girl. So that's where it's like I would put her kind of second, because there is a lot of that aspect to her. But
Voiced
Riku
by Tara
also,
Strong.
voiced by Tara Strong, she also shows up in Kingdom Hearts.
Mm.
And obviously she's a strong enough character that she follows through in 10-2 as well. And has some really great, I mean, like, the thing about 10-2 is that it's mostly just about character design. It's costumes.
Yeah.
And the two of them, Yuna and Riku, have some great costumes in that game that just really stand out. But yeah, it would be Orin for me. What about you? Are you on the same track?
I mean, I think Auron definitely uh hit that favorite mark for me. I had a
Yeah.
brief phase in the early 2000s where I was attempting to learn how to draw, and
Mm,
between like Goku, Trunks, and Auron, those were my three favorite characters to at least try to draw. I was never amazing at it, so I kind of just gave it up. But Auron was just, there was something just badass about him.
yeah.
That strong, silent. I think most of his antagonistic came from, like, he's only going to give you exactly the amount of information you need and not a bit more. So he's
Yeah.
always hiding something.
Yeah.
Um, and he's that strong, silent warrior monk type that I just loved. That, and he usually dealt the most damage. So
Yeah.
he was my
Yeah.
favorite to fight with. I often fought Tidus, Waka, and Arn were my three mains.
Yeah. Yeah, well, he has the Ronin vibe, right? Like,
Yes.
he's this sort of like disgraced samurai sort of thing, but still like a Yojimbo or a Lone Wolf and Cub type of story, where it's like, oh, it's a fall from grace, but only because of, like, social status, not because of his internal sort of I don't know, like his morality, right? Like, he's still a hero, he's still a good guy, he's still fighting to save the world, um but the components of it, where he's like, I yeah, kind of lost his honor, right? Like, he's I don't even know if that's really the case, because it's like they fulfilled their mandate, right? Like, they did what
Yeah.
they were supposed to do. It's just that, like, Jecht, I think it's the perspective of Jecht that makes us sort of almost start to look at him as antagonistic. um because Jecht is this, force in Tidus's life, that he's at odds with constantly, because he blames him for his mother's death. But at the same time, it's like, well, but, like, you kind of only exist because of Jecht and the decisions that he made, the heroic decisions that he made.
Right.
Um and and I and and ultimately Tidus makes the same decisions, right? Tidus just actually, like, pulls it off, right? Like,
Yeah.
they end the cycle, but Tidus doesn't get there without Jecht going first, if that makes sense, right? Like, Jecht kind of has to lay the groundwork for that. um and Oren is the character that Jecht carries that out through. And so the I think that's the antagonism there, right? Is this idea that Oren is manipulating them. He's kind of always moving them towards this. He's constantly telling Tidus, you can't tell anybody about this, right? Like, you have to. They won't understand. They'll look at you differently. You can't do this, that sort of thing. Um, and so yeah, he is very like he's standing in the way between Yuna and Tidus, right? Like I think from a story perspective, that's what that's about, is that we get mad at him because it's like, well, if he just told Yuna, I'm sure that she would understand, right? But it's like, oh, but you can't tell her because she won't get it, and she'll look at you differently, and you'll basically be a monster to her, and like all these things. And it's like, that's not the case. I and I think that like overcoming that is sort of how the story comes full circle, right? um I and then yeah,
Well,
and then them ultimately defeating Sin and all of that, and his father, and you know it all comes together at the end.
yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, what's interesting is they actually originally planned for Aaron to be Jecht in disguise,
Mm,
instead of, spoiler alert for a 24-year-old game. The big bad Sin is Jecht because
yeah,
after every iteration of Sin is defeated, one of the Guardians becomes Sin. So in the last iteration, Jecht became Sin, and that's why Aaron got furious because it kills the summoner and one of the Guardians. Um, and he felt like they failed even though they succeeded, but he lost his two best friends and ultimately his own life. This game has some amazing plot twists in it.
yeah, yeah. It is a very like it's very heavy on that stuff. Again, there's a lot of Star Wars influence there, right? There's a lot of the but a lot of Final Fantasy actually has there's quite a bit of Star Wars storytelling throughout all of them. But this one's one of the heavier ones, I think, because like that father son relationship, and the your dad is actually the big bad guy component is very much the Darth Vader thing, and it's the timing of it is coincidental, let's say, at best, because again, we're talking about the era of the prequels, right? This is smack dab in the middle of it, between episode 1 and 2. So I yeah, yeah, it's part of that. It's part of that era of storytelling. I think it's only in hindsight that we can look back at 1999 to 2005 and really recognize how influential George Lucas was a second time on the way that pop culture shaped stories,
Right.
because Anakin Skywalker's story, which we all now take for granted, right? Like this is kind of one of the wild things about the prequels. It wouldn't be a podcast with me if we didn't get into the Star Wars connection to all of it. But it's wild to me how everyone knows the story of Anakin Skywalker now, right? Like it is pretty ubiquitous. It's not quite as ubiquitous as Luke, I am your father, which isn't even the line, right?
Right.
But like because that's the degree to which that permeates pop culture, is that it actually, the thing that has permeated pop culture is actually not even in the movie, or at least not in the same fashion, right? Like the line has been completely changed, in the same way that May the Force be with you is attributed to Obi-Wan Kenobi, and he never says it. He never says it in the original trilogy, right? Han actually says it, but and that's not how most people remember that. I, but but the prequels and that idea of going back and telling the backstory, the idea of the sins of the father, all of that stuff that the prequels very heavily deal in are in so many pieces of pop culture at that time period. And people want to pretend like the prequels, oh, they're bad movies, they didn't have the same pop culture influence that the original trilogy had. And it's like, I'm sorry, Jar Jar Binks is a milestone in technical achievement. I The episode 2 is the first blockbuster movie fully filmed on digital. Like he did the same stuff. He did the exact same thing with the prequels that he did with the original trilogy. It just took 20 years for us to all look back and realize it.
Right.
But now we can look back and you can go like, look at everything that changed because of those three movies. Look, and like, but for better or worse, right? Because some of that stuff is like a lot of the way that computer graphics get used in film today is informed by the way that they were misused in the prequels, right?
Mm.
The idea of like everything's on a blue screen, we'll fill it in later. We don't do that as much anymore, and the volume exists now as a response to that, of like, actually let's go the other way around, right? Because with the volume you actually have to do all of the digital work in advance. It's a completely different production flow,
Right.
because you have to have it ready. It's going to be there on the day, but it's so much better for the actors, right? And that is a direct response. That's a direct response to Revenge of the Sith and the way that that movie was filmed, and then subsequently movies like Sky Captain, The World of Tomorrow, and stuff like that, that were also, equally trying to push the envelope there. But yeah, like we don't have film today if we don't have, the prequels as they are, and even in the midst of all of that, I they influence so much of the pop culture around it. There are so many stories from the early 2000s that are about a father and a son, and the, like this like betrayal component, and it turns out that your father that was the bad guy actually was a hero in his own time, and you just didn't realize it. And this is all daddy issue stuff, right? Of like, when we become adults and we realize that our parents they were actually people at one point
Right.
in time. They haven't always just been parents, but we're actually like human beings with their own hopes and dreams. And we hit that as we hit sort of like later adolescence, and our really when we hit our early 20s, and definitely when we have kids. When you have kids, all of a sudden your parents take on a completely different light. And you're like, oh, they had things that they wanted to do with their lives too, and then they had kids, and then it gets in the way, right?
Yeah.
Because it becomes your priority, right? I And when you bring it back to Final Fantasy X, the thing about it is that Jecht never stops, right? He doesn't stop to become a father. And that's the rift there, right? is
Right.
that
Right.
is that you know I Tidus is forced to grow up without a dad because Jecht kept the objective forefront, right? He never stopped the mission, and eventually that mission becomes Tidus's mission, and then the two of them reconcile over that fact, right? Over the fact that
Mhm.
Tidus will, you know, realize that vision, and complete the objective. But there's like, you then get to juxtapose that with Yuna, who grows up without her father, as a result of all of this. And so like they kind of like that's the bond between those two characters, right? Is that they're
Yeah.
both sort of like without their fathers, but for very different reasons, and they have very different perspectives on it, because Yuna very much sees her father as a hero and as this ideal that she's striving towards. I'm gonna follow in his footsteps. I'm gonna be a summoner. I'm gonna do this because he was, and all that stuff. um yeah,
Uh,
it is a pretty good video game. It's a pretty good video game, Tim. I think you've turned me around on it. Maybe it is a perfect 10.
it really is, and I think the only other thing that I would have to bring up is I don't think we can talk about this game without giving the due to Nobuo Uematsu.
Yes.
The music in this game, I have listened to probably the soundtrack probably thousands of times at this point,
Yeah.
because like I've used it to fall asleep to. We considered using the To Xanarkin song as my wife's walk-in music when we got married, because it's
Awesome.
just so beautiful. Um, he really outdid himself on this game and the music. It's like an 80s song soundtrack, and every one of them just hits for me.
Yeah, it is a great soundtrack, but that is one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's a Final Fantasy game in that era, right? Umatsu just was cranking them out with every iteration, right? Every one of the games that he scored has a pretty great score. It's just the way it is. Yeah, Umatsu is like is a master, obviously. And then that's why it's 16 was such a revelation to me, because it wasn't Umatsu, right? It's
Okay.
Masayoshi Soken does the score for that, and Soken takes Umatsu's work and pluses it, right? Like
Okay.
that's like that that I think was his mission in doing the score for 16. There's a lot, he pulls a lot from Final Fantasy 8 specifically,
Okay.
because there's a lot of connective tissue between those two. 16 is actually the sequel to 8. It's just like it's a secret sequel. It's like it's there if you know what you're looking at.
And I've listened to some of the music from 16. It was really good.
16, the score in 16 is, honestly, to me, the score in 16 is what puts it over the top as my favorite Final Fantasy, and the reason why we covered it in Perfect 10. Because yeah, it just like Joe and I go into it, but it that score is something really really special. But that's kind of the thing about the Final Fantasy games of this era. I and what I loved so much about 16, and why I felt like it was really like a return to form, because 12 has got a good score as well. It's good. But it didn't really like there's no, for me, there's not a moment in 12 where I'm like, oh yeah, right. But 7, 8, 10, Kingdom Hearts all have these incredible moments in the scores where you hear that music and you are transported back to the game,
Hmm.
right? And that, to me, like, you get to 16 and they do it again. And I haven't played any of the online ones, so I don't know. Fans of the online Final Fantasies probably have similar feelings about some of the music in there, I'm sure, because you're spending so much time with it. But yeah, like, I feel you on that. Like, 10 has some incredible music.
Right.
Some really, really beautiful stuff. I In order to prep for this episode, because I didn't have time to like actually go back and play the game, obviously.
You didn't have
Um,
time to play 100 hours just
no,
for a
so
single episode?
yeah,
Uh,
but I did watch a recap video, and the recap video was obviously, wall to wall with the incredible score from this game,
mhm.
and so much of it I was like, oh yeah, man, that's good stuff. Like, there's really really good stuff in this game. um and like, beyond the stuff that I think we end up really like associating with each iteration, which is like the battle music and stuff like that, main themes. But there's just some really great background music in this game as well. Like,
Yeah.
just like the different environments have different songs, obviously, and some of it is some of the best stuff in Final Fantasy, I think.
Yeah.
I think you're on point with that. It is definitely something that elevates this one beyond the story and the graphics and the voice acting and all of the stuff that we've talked about up until this point. Yeah, there's Umatsu really really nails it. But it's unfair. The environment for Final Fantasy X just lends itself, right?
Yeah.
Because it's just like, it is about these beautiful, incredible vistas, and this, and like the ocean, and all of that. It's like Wind Waker with the Zelda games, right? Like, I think Wind
Right.
Waker has the best score, like, for me. But I also like Wind Waker is also like, it's probably my favorite Zelda game, and
Okay.
it's got that same like ocean vibe to it. You're traversing the sea in Wind Waker, and you don't quite do the same thing in this one in Final Fantasy X, but like, there's a lot of being on a ship, and like,
Yeah.
just the expanse of the ocean, and just water, and the beauty of that, and the unlimited possibility, right? And so, you just, between that and tropical jungles and these beautiful paradises that everybody lives in. Um, yeah, it's unfair. It's unfair because he just gets to like he doesn't have to ever get into like a. I guess that's not true. I guess with some of the Albed stuff, there's a little bit of the like dirty grunge stuff that some of the other Final Fantasies get into.
Yeah,
But
and definitely some in the Xanarch end of the past slash
yeah,
of the
yeah,
dream, like the opening, the there's a song called Otherworld that's kind of it's basically the soundtrack to the opening sequence, and that's really like a heavy metal rock, like
yeah.
screaming, more like I guess more like a what's the German band? Um,
Oh, like a
mo
Rammstein or
yeah,
whatever.
it's much more
Yeah,
of a Rammstein type,
yeah,
metal than, like, the American,
yeah,
screamo bands of today or anything, but,
yeah.
uh, it was so good, and it just hooks you from the word go.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it definitely does that. But that is one of those things where it's like it's funny how we can go an hour before we even get into the music, and then talk at length about it. But really, neither I don't think either one of us are really music guys, right? So it's like I could just be like, yeah, it's great. I really love it. I can't really get into like I don't know enough about music to like break it down and I really like analyze it.
Right.
I just know I know what I like. I'll know it when I hear it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I'm not a music theory guy. Like, I've played
Yeah.
instruments in my, school years, but um there was a period, especially in high school, that I was all about movie, video game, and TV show scores.
Yeah.
And this was
Yeah, same.
top of the chart. It was up there with anything John Williams did for me,
Yeah.
in terms of just how much I like if I had a cassette tape of this soundtrack, it would have worn out.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. We're dating ourselves talking about cassette tapes, but I yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like the thing is like I can't get into the nitty gritty of that stuff because I don't know it because I don't know I can't play music. I don't can't read music, can't any of that sort of thing. But I love listening to other people
Mhm.
talk about music in that way. Like the soundtrack show, right?
I
Like
I wish that would come back so badly.
yeah,
I mean, I know he's busy,
yeah,
but
yeah, you're making Star Wars, but yeah, but that's such a great podcast for exactly that when you want to like really dig in
Mhm.
on music. And yeah, I I I don't he hasn't done a Final Fantasy yet, has he?
I don't think so.
He's
My
because I think he
favorite
did
is
Ocarina of Time, but
that was my favorite series he did was, yeah,
yeah.
because that's my Legend of Zelda, um because it's I mean, I know it's most people's
Oh
favorite.
no, I can't. That's a it's a it's one of those ones where people go like, "Oh, this is a boring answer," and it's like, no, it's not. It's not a boring answer. It's the answer. Like it definitely. I get it. I get why most people are gonna say that.
Right.
Like it's like Final Fantasy 7. Like I get it. I get it. It doesn't resonate for me. I don't particularly like Final Fantasy 7, but I understand why so many people have such an affinity for it, why they're so connected to it. It is a great game. It's a great story. It's just not the one that hits for me, and I'm just the outlier where it's like because 16 also not as well received as 8 when those are my two favorites. And yeah, it's like it's not even a fight that I'll fight because I know I won't win it. It's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, whatever. And then Wind Waker is the same way, where it's like I absolutely adore Wind Waker. It is far
Mhm.
from my first Zelda game, and yet it's the one that like I wish more of them were like. Yeah, it Wind Waker, and then on the DS, on the 3DS, Link Between Worlds
Mm.
are my two favorites, and I know that I am not in the majority when I say that, and that's not even to be like a, oh, I have cooler opinions. It's like, no, like I get why people are gonna lean more towards Final Fantasy VII, you know, Ocarina of Time, even like the newer ones, Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom and that stuff. Like, you know, like I get it. I get why other people are more into those things, but I just I'm a bit of a weirdo with some of that stuff, because it's like I don't think that I'm looking for the same stuff that everybody else is looking for necessarily, even though I'm like into the same things, right? Like the same sort of pop culture whatever, right? Like that
Right.
the stuff that is popular. I just I don't know, as a I don't think that I am looking for the typically male things
Fair.
in it, right? But yeah, and I Final Fantasy X is an interesting game in that respect, because I feel like 10 kind of rides the line. It's not, because I look at 7, and 7 is very like male bravado,
Hmm.
giant sword. What I wonder what that could be an accidental metaphor for. Um, you know, like all of that sort of stuff. Like it's the two main characters in Final Fantasy VII. One has a giant, thick, massive sword, and the other one has an incredibly long sword, right?
Yeah.
Let's, we don't need to analyze that in order to know what's going on there with those character designs. um I Yeah, but like my favorites 8 and 16, I think, are, they're so much more about the internal struggle of the hero. And I talked about this a lot when we talked about 16. The reason why it resonated so much, and why Clive is such a standout protagonist in the Final Fantasy franchise for me, is um his vulnerability.
Hmm.
He's a very the character is an open wound, right? Like that's he's got the scar on his face, and that I think is very telling about what type of character he is. And it's interesting because that is the one of the similar components between him and Squall, because Squall
Okay.
also has that scar on his face. And when we look at that from a mythic perspective, now I'm going down the what the Force route, right? When we look at that from that mythic perspective, that means something, right?
Yeah.
Anakin has a scar on his face. Squall,
Aaron.
Clive, Orin, I was about to say, Orin also has it. He's my favorite character from the game. It's the reason why you put the scar on the face is because it's a persistent reminder to the audience, this character is wounded. This
Right.
character has trauma. There's something in this character's past that they haven't reconciled, that they haven't dealt with,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, it's a constant reminder to us, that there's a deep trauma that is motivating and propelling this character to make the decisions that they make. And I Titus is actually, because he's so youthful and he's such a pretty boy. I mean, like he looks like a member of NSYNC, right? Like that was
Yeah.
the joke back in the day, was that like Final Fantasy X is like the boy band, Final Fantasy, right? Because
And
you've
then they
got,
went and made a girl band.
yeah, you've
Uh,
got Tidus and Waka, right? And it's like, and that's the era. That's the era. Like the early 2000s are the era of the boy band, right? And like, and you know, like the pop singer, you know, Britney Spears type of thing.
mhm.
And that's what Yuna is, right? Like there, it's but it's there because like it's not even it's not even subtext. It is quite literal, right? He is
Right.
a blitzball star, right? Like he is, like everybody loves him because he's great at sports and he's very pretty, right? That's what Titus is about. And then goes on this journey and becomes a hero and learns about, you know, sacrifice and all of that sort of thing. I So that's why I say like it very much like rides the line. It's not, I wouldn't consider it masculine or overly feminine as a story. Like it's kind of like right in the middle there.
Yeah, it's
Um,
very balanced on that front, I think.
yeah. Whereas I think like Final Fantasy 8, Final Fantasy 6, and Final Fantasy 16, which are my three favorites in the franchise, they are very um female gaze
Mm,
stories. Six, the protagonist being a woman. And yeah, I that I think like that's one of those things. That's one of those things that it's like as I get older and as I reflect on the things that resonate with me and that I have gravitated towards as my favorites from franchises that run the gamut, right? Because it's kind of you have to look at it from that lens of like something like Final Fantasy or Star Wars or Zelda or I don't know, like the MCU, all of that stuff. Where it's like, what are the ones that have resonated with me, and I learn more and more that it's like, and this is because I have listened to Ty and Missy and MC talk about stuff, and I have had conversations with them over the years and realized sorry, I also have to put Danielle in there in that because she's been such a massive part of me exploring that stuff as well. And it's like, oh, I don't know why, I don't know what it is, but it is just part of me that like I just connect to that feminine energy and story.
right.
And yeah, but I mean, like there is a lot of it in 10, and I've never played through 10 too. I only like sort of know it like culturally, right, as an
Right.
anime video game fan. So I know it because it's such a massive departure from the rest of Final Fantasy, but I've never actually played it. And part of me is always like, or not always, but like in the last few years has been like, I should probably pick up 10 too. It's probably more your speed. Like it's probably one that like I'll like, oh, I will connect to it.
I'd be interested to
Um
hear that, whether it is or
yeah,
not.
yeah,
I've got a well, I'm almost done with a playthrough of 10, and then I really need to go back and beat Tears of the Kingdom on
yeah,
my
yeah,
Switch, and then
for
maybe I
sure.
will try to revisit 10 too and see if maybe it hits better for me at 37 than it did at 17.
Yeah. I
Um,
think yeah, I think that you will be able to appreciate it no matter what your perspective is on it, whether you end up enjoying it more or not. I think that you'll just like with maturity you'll be able to appreciate what they were doing.
right,
Because it is beloved, like that game has its fans. So there's something there has to be something there, and that is one of those other things that I think as I get older and talking about something like Final Fantasy X, which is not as well received in the fandom, right? But as I get older, I learn to appreciate more and more that it's not all about you, right? You know what I mean? Like it's not all about the thing that you would like it to be. I just recently I saw a clip from a stand-up comedian, and he's talking about Dragon Ball and how like Dragon Ball now, I was like, oh, like they just he's asked about Krillin, and it like
mm,
what his thoughts are on Krillin. It's like, well, Krillin was one of the strongest fighters in the world. He's the strongest human, but then these Saiyans just keep getting more and more powerful, and Krillin has like reached the peak of like what a human being can be, right? And
right.
it's unfair. Like he used to be such a great character, and now he's just like a side character, as these Saiyans go from yellow to red to blue to silver, and you know, um, and where he makes a point is he absolutely makes a point. I I watch Dragon Ball from a very different perspective. I really don't care about the power levels. I really don't care about the fights. I actually tend to tune out a little bit, because now I watch Dragon Ball Z from with two perspectives. I watch it as somebody who's trying to deconstruct his own internal toxic masculinity,
Right.
because that's I think ultimately what Goku's story is about, is that like that's what makes Goku the hero that he is, and it's what he shares in common with Superman, is that they have somehow surpassed, ascended beyond toxic masculinity into like real masculinity, and it's outwardly represented in the fact that they can punch the moon, right? Like that's the genre mythic sort of story that we're telling there is that like, well, this man is the strongest man who will ever live.
Yeah.
But the important part of that is not that he is the strongest man that will ever live. It is that he is kind.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what, like, so I watch Dragon Ball, and it's like the more powerful Goku gets, the more important it is that he's kind. The more powerful that Superman is, the more important it is that he's kind.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's and I'll tie that back into 10, because I think that is something that Tidus also shares. I think that that's a common thread with that character. I
Yeah.
think in juxtaposition to a character like Cloud, or a character like Squall, or Clive, or any of the other protagonists, um, Tidus is very much that sort of like pure soul, like that kindness embodied, right? So it doesn't
Right.
matter that he defeats a god, right? That he destroys sin and all of that along with Yuna. What matters, and the reason why she loves him, is because it goes back to that moment. It goes back to that laugh, right? Why does he do that? Why does he do that? He does it because he sees her in pain, and he's like, listen, I know things suck, but even when things suck, we can still find things to be happy about. We can still find joy. We can still keep going, because otherwise, what are we fighting for?
Right.
What's the point of all of it, right? And that moral compass is the thing that is constant with that character.
And
And
ultimately it's what drives her through the story, is that
yeah,
moment, because she's realizing, yes, we're in this world with sin and destruction and death, but the summoners are the laughs. They are the 10 years of the calm are the beacons of joy that uh that the world needs to get through.
yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah,
he kind of gives that
man,
to her all throughout, to carry her through on her journey.
yeah. I think this is a story. I think this is an important story that we need now, right? Like in a moment like this. So it's funny that we're talking about this now, because I think that we're in the middle of a very dark and depressing era of
Mhm.
humanity, that is preceded by what a lot of us looked at as sort of a pinnacle, right? But in the same way in Final Fantasy X, that it's revealed that, like, well, you know, the summoner has to sacrifice one of their guardians, one of their best friends, in order to achieve this 10-year peace. So it's all built on basically a lie, right? It's actually all built on this like moral corruption, um in order to do that, like and that Yuna is going to sacrifice herself in order to achieve it, and the idea of like ending the cycle and all of that sort of thing. And I look at where we are now, and I look at the sort of I'm turning 40 this year, so
Mm.
it's doing a lot of retrospection and introspection at the same time. And that process makes you look at it and go, like, as a kid, we really thought in the 90s that we'd done it. We really, every like, and I don't mean that we as kids did. I mean, like, culturally in the West, and especially white people, thought, oh, we did it. I It's okay to be gay. It's okay to be black. It's okay to, we said it, we as white people, we said that as if two things were true. A, what we were saying was real. It was not,
Right.
right? And B, we had any authority to make the decision. You know what I mean? That's sort of the lie there, is that is that like white people were on TV shows, like Zach Morris is on Saved by the Bell going like, racism is bad. And a generation of kids are watching that going like, oh, I guess we solved it then.
Right.
because Zach said it, right?
We
And
fixed
like,
racism.
yeah, we fixed racism. Oh, it's okay to be gay. Okay. Not that they ever said that on Saved by the Bell, but like other stuff later on would start to do that, like Ellen and
Will and
Friends
Grace.
and whatever, and Will and Grace, right? It's like, oh, it's okay. As if we had solved those problems for good. And I think that was just such an example of white, cis het privilege,
Right.
to be able to go like, we fixed it all. uh, be thankful, be grateful, right? And then all of it, like, it builds up over the decades. Not quite. It's a quicker timeline in Final Fantasy X, but it's the same. I think that that's the allegory there, right?
Yeah.
Is that, and I think that from a Japanese perspective, you're looking at post-war Japan. You
Right.
almost always are. When it comes to anime and video games, it's almost always what it is. There, so much of their culture, I mean, so much of our culture as well, but just modern Japan, so much of what they have become is tied deeply into the roots of what they needed to do to survive post 1940s, and the decisions that were made during World War II, right?
Right.
And then the repercussions of that, the consequences of that, them not being able to produce military. They had no military industrial complex like we did here in North America. Certainly, the United States has become the country that it is because of the military industrial complex post World War II. Japan was not allowed to have that. As a result, they shifted all of their manufacturing into technology and became the essentially the birthplace of the microchip, right? And that's why we see in Japanese storytelling, we see things like Ghost in the Shell and Evangelion and all of this, where it's like, it's this balance, and it's in this story as well, this balance between technology, machines, and life,
Right.
right? And it's like, what? Because the hammer that can be used to build can also be used to tear down the wall, right? Like that. And Japan, I think, wrestles with that. And so I think, like, this story is it's very much about that same sort of thing of, like, I mean, sin is essentially Godzilla, right? It's
Yeah.
the same thing. It's the
Oh
same
yeah.
thing, that, like, it's this thing that comes back every 10 years in order to destroy it. It's to balance and correct the mistakes of the past, right? They built up these machines, the machina, right, to the point where they could, destroy themselves. And then sin comes along and resets it back to a more pastoral sort of life. And every time a society builds up that technology, sin shows up every 10 years to keep that in check. And I think that there's no other way to look at that. There's no other way to look at that than through that post World War II lens of Japan building itself back up, but never forgetting what they became. Right.
You mean that there's no uh symbolism in sin being the father?
Well, it's all right there, right? Yeah, yeah. And you know what? Like, I haven't played 13. I've never finished 12. But the ones that I bounced off of, they don't have this. They don't
Right.
have this, right? And like I said, 10, I it's not that I didn't want to finish 10. It's that you hit that wall, and then,
Mhm.
especially because I wasn't playing it in my own home, it then became a very difficult thing to go back to and finish. But um yeah, like, the ones that do end up resonating, the ones that I end up sticking with, they have these deeper meanings to them.
Yeah.
This has been a good episode. I feel like we it was a slow build, but I do think that we got there over the
Yeah.
course of 2 hours. Whew. Okay, and we
I
just hit
wasn't
the
I
2 hour
wasn't
mark
sure how
as
long
I
this
said
was
that.
gonna go when you said you never finished the game, and I was like, "Oh, okay,
Mhm.
well, this may not go all that long," and then here we are 2 hours later.
Yeah, yeah. But all of that is to say, I think we did it.
I think
I
so.
think yeah, I think we've made a case for this game as a perfect 10. You've convinced me for sure. You've turned me around on it. At the beginning I was like, it's not really a perfect 10 for me, and now I'm looking at it, I'm going like, no, when we compare this to the other Final Fantasy games in the franchise, it's like it's not my number one, right? But I'll put it in my top 5 for sure.
Right.
For sure. Joe will be very happy to hear that, because I know this is one of his favorites as well.
Oh, okay.
So actually, I don't know. Maybe it is his favorite. I don't. I'd have to go back and listen to one of our previous Final Fantasy episodes. It might be. I think it might be his favorite as well. But I maybe I should have just let him host this one instead of me.
We'd be going another 2 hours.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome. Well, I mean, like, this has been great. This has been a great conversation. You got to start thinking about what your next one's going to be, because we'll definitely do this again.
I already have thoughts on that. I just need to get you onto it.
Yeah, I know the ones that you floated. I'm like, this is a bit of a more of an uphill climb, but we'll discuss.
Right.
Yeah, no, this has been a great episode. Thank you so much for being on again. Thank you so much for the pop quiz.
Oh, it's so much fun.
And on top of that, everything that you do in the Thunderquack community, you're one of our main people over there on the Discord, and keeping things alive and going, and I appreciate that so much, because sometimes I don't have the energy or the time to be in the Discord as much as I should be, as the guy who, made all of us weirdos come together.
Yeah.
But I know that it's in good hands with folks like you. So, yeah, I'll just take this moment to say thanks for that as well.
Well, and thank you for all you've done for the community over the years. I know you've been doing this for a very long time, and
Yeah.
I have been with Thunderquack for probably 7 or 8 years at this point.
Mm.
So you've provided me hours and hours of relatively free entertainment.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, that's why I keep doing it. So, so thank you. Yeah, I have to note, as we close this one out, um, this is the 10th anniversary in January. It's the 10th anniversary of Thunderquack. We are on Perfect 10. We're talking about Final Fantasy 10. That's a triple X.
Yeah.
On that one, it's a triple X. It's so funny. I love finding those weird coincidences, because this was when we decided to do Final Fantasy 10 in this spot. Like, I had put you in the January spot before you had decided what your topic would be. So
Right.
I was just like, yeah, okay, we'll do that. We'll put you there. And it was really about, like, there are a few episodes that go in specific places, right? Like, me and Danny do the Christmas episode now. So it's like, when I was scheduling this season and looking at it, for the whole thing, it was like, yeah, okay, I'll just put it there. And then you're like, Final Fantasy 10. And then as we got closer, I was like, it's the 10th anniversary and we're doing Perfect 10 and it's Final Fantasy 10. So it's a funny coincidence, but that's it for this episode. Right before we close out here, give your plugs again. Tell people where they can find you on the internet.
Yeah. So for podcasting, obviously Perfect 10 Pop Quiz. But also you could find me over on the PTE network hosting Frenemy Trivia. We release every other week. Most of the time it's a little bit of a labor, so occasionally we miss a bi-weekly episode. But you can find Frenemy Trivia anywhere you find your podcasts. You can find us on Blue Sky primarily. We don't post a whole lot on social media these days. You can find me on Blue Sky. I'm a TD gamer, very old name, over on Blue Sky. But Frenemy Trivia, anywhere you find your podcast, we'd love to have. If you're into trivia, we'd love to have you on to play. If you're just kind of I watch Jeopardy here and there, tune in. You'll have a good time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you guys are doing awesome stuff over there. I love it. I love you have like a whole, like, game show network basically of podcasts, and that's so cool. It's so fun. Awesome. Well, again, thank you, Tim. And hey, special heads up if you've listened all the way to the end of this one. The Perfect 10 pop quiz that's coming out with this, like to as a companion to this episode, will not be hosted by Tim because Tim was on this episode. It will be hosted by me, and I have to go finish writing all of my trivia questions. I think I've got 6 done.
I can't wait to see what you have.
I got a few more. Yeah, it's gonna be fun. A lot of the answers are already in this episode, FYI. But that's usually how it is. It's so funny how that ends up working out almost every single time.
Yeah,
I
actually make it a point. I have not listened to the 10th anniversary episode yet because I like to write for the property and then see whether or not the episode covers the topic.
Yeah. Well, John Carter has a lot of trivia, so you've got a lot to choose from on that one. Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for listening. Thanks for hanging in there. This was a slightly longer episode, but that's good. I think it warranted it. I think we had a good discussion by the end of it. A lot of really cool revelations about Final Fantasy X. So I hope everybody enjoyed that, and I hope you guys stick around for more episodes. I know that people drop in, and I'll just say, first off, if you are a Final Fantasy fan, we've got 16 and we've got Kingdom Hearts as well, so go listen to those episodes too. But subscribe, because even if we end up talking about something that you're not familiar with, I guarantee you, as has happened with this episode, and this is the wonderful thing about this, is that when we get together to talk about these things that we just love, it's infectious, man. It's infectious. So if there's stuff in the past episodes that you're like, not really my thing, and you've skipped those episodes, go back and listen to them, because it really is, I think, a great thing. And the reason why I keep doing this podcast for such a small audience is that, like, I think it's just really important for us to have spaces on the internet where we are just expressing love, where we're just getting into this thing because this is a thing that we love, and not toxic positivity, but just like to just be effusive about a thing. And I like, that's what fandom should be. And I think that we miss that. We lose it in the crusade for all sorts of things, justice, and I don't know, being right, and all of that sort of stuff that happens when we're on the internet for too long. So that's it for this one. Go back and listen to some previous ones. Hang around for the stuff that we got coming up. If you're a video game fan, our next episode will also be video games. And I'm really excited to talk about this one because it's Ratchet and Clank. It's another James Arnold Taylor joint. Ty's going to come on to talk about that, which when she presented that as one of the options for this season, I was like, you want to talk about Ratchet and Clank? It was unexpected, and but such a great surprise. And so I'm really excited to talk to Ty about Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart next month. So look forward to that one. And the rest of the season, we have awesome stuff in the lineup coming up. So thank you guys for listening to Thunderquack Perfect 10. If you found joy in today's discussion, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast service and leave a rating and review. And if you want to chat about today's episode, you can head over to our Discord at thunderquack.com/Discord. Until next time, remember, it's not about the score, it's about the love. Stay frosty. Thunderquack Perfect 10 is hosted by me, Michael Cohen. Follow us on TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at TQPerfect10, and join the community at thunderquack.com/Discord. This podcast is supported by listeners just like you over at patreon.com/Thunderquack. Head over there to get early access to episodes, exclusive podcasts, and more. This show is a part of the Thunderquack Podcast Network. Head over to thunderquack.com for more great shows. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.